And I just wanted to kind of ask you guys, what's been some of your experiences? Some of you have worked with corporate outlets as for freelance pieces. Some of you have appeared in corporate outlets. I'll start with you. What's kind of been your experience? Because to me, corporate media and the advertisers are equally as toxic, if not more, than the donor class.
All right, I like that. Yeah. So my foray into political journalism started off with, some people might be familiar with current affairs. I wrote a piece called The Color of Economic Anxiety. And it was a bit of a challenge pitching it, I think, for a few reasons. One of them being that I wanted to do a deep dive of kind of this assumption of what the working class looks like, and the assumption that black people across the board, but black people who are working class in particular, aren't attracted and aren't these progressive policies and left policies and socialism doesn't appeal to them. And so in pitching it, you know, it's a long form article. I had to go to Wisconsin and do a lot of work for it. But I think a major challenge was the fact that in talking about them and saying that they were attracted to these policies, and they weren't just suppressed in Wisconsin, they weren't just suppressed because of, you know, Russian interference, but they were suppressed because of neoliberal policies that have, you know, decimated the region for decades. And then having to highlight the fact that these aren't necessarily as important to these communities, I think it made it a little bit difficult to pitch. So I went there, for instance, the fall of 2017. That was when I first started doing the reporting. And it didn't get published until October 2018 because I knew somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody at Current Affairs. And then after that, I had, you know, a number of kind of reporters from those mainstream outlets hit me up and was like, yo, that was a great piece. I like what you did there. But it's harder if you don't have relationships with editors. And so I think the way that I kind of carved my way, even working with some sort of corporate outlets, was finding editors who are sympathetic, because even if the corporate overlords, you know, per se, don't value these perspectives, you might have an editor in there. And so, you know, that helped at News One, that helped at Essence, where I was able to talk about Fred Hampton and, you know, the US government conspiring against black radical organizations. That helped at The Root, which is owned by Univision. I was able to put in a dig about Nancy Pelosi and capitalism in general, and at The Guardian. So knowing people has kind of helped me carve a way, but when you are black and you are in the left, you're kind of marginalized on both fronts, because people expect you to have a black beat that is very kind of pro-establishment Democrat. And because of that, because I'm a leftist, it's harder to even just get just regular, let's talk about Medicare for all, let's talk about the failures of the liberal establishment. It's harder to also do that. So that's it.
Ms. Halpern, your experiences?
What I really focus on is this smearing of Sanders, because it's not just about Sanders, it's about the ideas that he represents. And as you pointed out, you know, it's one thing for Bret Stephens, however you say his name, which I don't like saying. It's one thing for him to really write hit pieces against the left and about Sanders, but it's another thing for reported pieces to do that. And I actually just wrote a piece at F.A.I.R, Fairness and Accuracy and Reporting, which goes through some of the pieces that this woman, Sydney Ember, uses, and particularly focuses on the sources she uses. And it's amazing, like you can't make it up. First of all, she comes from BlackRock, that's her experience. She was an analyst at BlackRock, which is like the biggest investor in fuel, in coal, sorry. Her father-in-law was the CEO at Bain. And her sources that she goes to get to smear Sanders are, not only are they awful, but then she covers up who they are. So she had, to be fair, I think she's not just ideological, I think she's also not very smart. So, for instance, she actually included Otto Reich, like in her piece about Bernie's foreign policy, she included a guy who did PR for the Contras. So she got a quote from him. And I would have thought like an older person at the Times would have been like, we don't do that. Like that's too over the top. We don't go to Contras spokespeople, but they didn't. She like cited someone who works in education, but who doesn't. He's just a lobbyist and a lawyer. She cited someone who worked for Hillary's campaign, but failed to reveal that. And this woman dismissed Bernie as an old white straight right man. And yeah, and then that, and then also the way that, like you referred to this, the weaponization of identity politics, and the way that there's a total selective focus on race and gender, that when it's relevant, it's incorporated into the discussion, relevant to the powers that be. And when it's an issue of something that like Malika covers, where, when basically all these people who claim to be intersectionalists are everything but class. They're intersectionalists except for class. And they, John is here from the Independent, and he's one of the only people I ever saw cover this physical. There were 2 physical attacks on women that we know about during the primaries. They were both by Hillary men on Bernie women. One was Wendell Pierce, unfortunate because I liked him on The Wire, Bunk from The Wire. He was charged with battery for attacking a woman who was a Sanders supporter, and the other one was Mumita Ahmed, who was hit by a guy who looked like Old Man Time. Sorry if that sounds ageist or something, but he looked like a villain, and he hit her with his hand and a cane. Like, you can't make it up. And it got no coverage whatsoever. And Hillary wasn't asked to disown it, to disavow it. And that, I feel like every day, if you pay attention to this stuff, it's just like total gaslighting. And it's infuriating. So thank you for this.
I just want to interject. Some of you might not know all this, but when you're talking about conflicts that are never disclosed, just in the first 3 months of this year, AT&T gave Kamala Harris $50,000 for her campaign. To be clear, it was individuals who work at AT&T, but the janitors and lower worker bees are not giving Kamala Harris $50,000. It's usually, owners of the company, senior management, their wives, so an executive can give money and then his wife gives money to double dip. So CNN's not disclosing that. No wonder they gave her a town hall 24 hours after she announced.
Right.
So this, obviously Jeff Bezos, I call it the Amazon Washington Post. Jennifer Rubin there is now doing 4 negative stories on Bernie per week. Comcast, which owns NBC, MSNBC. Biden's first fundraiser was with a major vice president / lobbyist for Comcast. These, just ethically, these should be disclosed at every segment. Not to mention when Time Warner owns CNN, Hillary Clinton's, I think, number 8 on her career donor list was Time Warner. So these things are not disclosed because the journalists don't actually see them as a conflict. I mean, WikiLeaks, which we should point out, it's a disgrace what's going on with Julian Assange, in my opinion. WikiLeaks revealed that in 2016, Chuck Todd of NBC was literally hosting a party for Hillary Clinton's communications chairwoman during the campaign. So these are all, why I say public relations for the establishment. And Katie brings up a good point because, I'm not going to minimize Fox News. We know what it is. But it's the same thing with the corporate Democratic Party. You need an opposition party, a real opposition party, to combat and defeat fascism. And you actually would need a progressive media outlet to correct the propaganda coming from the right. We don't have that on either end. So, sorry. And to remind you, Aaron has been doing great work, particularly on Russiagate, which I think is a dangerous deflection and distraction. You have, maybe more than any of us in the last 2-3 years, been dealing with corporate media going after you on Twitter, calling you a kook, a conspiracy theorist, a Putin puppet. So share your experiences dealing with the corporate echo chamber.
Well, yeah, I can't, to me, in my lifetime, aside from the Iraq War, I can't think of a bigger example of the dynamic we're talking about, where the corporate media's function is basically to serve the interests of the privileged sectors that own it, and also to cater to the privileged worldview of the privileged audiences that the corporate media owners want to sell ads to. If you look at presidential scandals over the last 50 years, the ones that have consumed political and media attention, I think there's a through line that Russiagate is very much a part of, where basically the biggest scandals are ultimately the result of intra-elite battles. They're not really relevant, or at least far less relevant to the concerns of everyday people. So take Nixon and Watergate He wasn't impeached for presiding over genocidal bombings of Cambodia and Vietnam and Laos, or presiding over COINTELPRO and the killing of Fred Hampton. He was impeached because he went after another faction of the elite. In the 80s with the terror war in Nicaragua under Reagan, that didn't become an issue for the Democrats because he was waging a terror war against Nicaragua. That was an issue because he wasn't telling Congress about it. And they wanted in on the action, which we're pretty much hearing now when it comes to Trump's war on Iran. The Adam Schiff, for example, one of the self-styled leaders of the resistance, his main point of contention is that Trump isn't consulting Congress on his war on Iran, which people like Schiff pretty much agree with when it comes to the underlying assumptions. And the only reason, by the way, Nicaragua became an issue in Congress, and there were some limits put on it, is because there was grassroots pressure, especially from church movements here in the U.S., which is sorely lacking now. Same thing with Bill Clinton. No impeachment over bombing Sudan or Afghanistan or Iraq, where he imposed genocidal sanctions, or for gutting welfare or massively increasing the mass incarceration and the carceral state, but because he lied about sexual relations with Lewinsky, and that was a great way for the other faction of the elite to go after him. And Russiagate to me is the apotheosis of all this, in the sense that, but the difference is it's I think a record level of elite convergence when it comes to elite interests, and it's also completely baseless. There's really, if you look at the genesis of it, there's nothing there. There were no Trump contacts with Russian officials. The predicate for the investigation is ridiculous, and I'm not even sure if we fully learned the full story of what the real predicate was. But regardless, in the case of Russiagate, you have many things going on. You have a campaign, a primary where Bernie Sanders has emerged, and he's threatened the establishment, and that alarms everybody. That alarms Democratic elites, and it also alarms Republican elites as well. Then you have Donald Trump, who is tapping into the very real animus there is out there towards the establishment. Of course, he's doing it as a con. He's portraying himself as a working class champion. He's also portraying himself as being anti-intervention and speaking to the anti-war sentiment in this country, especially to communities that are most impacted by war. And if you look at studies, there was a study done after the election which showed that there was a correlation between communities where there was the highest military sacrifice and support for Donald Trump. Again, not because Donald Trump is legitimately anti-war, but because he conned enough people into believing that he was. So you have factions of the elite in both parties, and also in the national security state, seeing this, coupled with the fact that Donald Trump is saying, for whatever reason, maybe because he wanted to build a hotel there, that he wanted better relations with Russia. And so all this is alarming to members of the elite of both parties and the national security state with which they're aligned. And so that's why during the Donald Trump campaign, you already had, even before all this collusion talk, you had record numbers of former national security state officials signing open letters denouncing Trump, not because they don't like his misogyny or racism, but because they don't like his anti-interventionist rhetoric. And they also don't see him as a suitable steward of the empire. They want someone more like Obama, who can put on the airs of being dignified and overseeing the war machine in sort of a dignified, seemingly liberal way. But really, it's the same death and destruction. And after Donald Trump wins, which surprises everybody, including me, I didn't see that one coming. That's a shock to everybody. And for Democrats especially, it's a challenge to their privileged status, because Donald Trump won by conning enough people into believing that he was going to fight the elite. He was going to drain the swamp. He was going to be a working class champion. And if you're a neoliberal Democrat, that's pretty much a repudiation of everything you stand for. And so in order to sustain in order to respond to that, you pretty much have two choices. You can do honest self-reflection and see, well, geez, what can we do to appeal to those people, that small sliver of people, which was enough to make the difference, who either stayed home in the election or who went over and voted for Donald Trump. Or you can come up with excuses and deflections. And obviously Russia was the perfect foil for that, which converges also, meanwhile, with people in the FBI like Jim Comey, John Brennan, who was then at the CIA, who despised Donald Trump because, again, for the reasons that I stated, they don't want to see better relations with Russia. They don't like his anti-interventionist rhetoric. So basically, you have this perfect convergence coupled with a corporate media, by the way, that loves to not talk about real issues, but they're presented now with this gift of this real-life spy thriller. So for everybody involved, it's too beneficial to pass up. So that explains, I think, the genesis of Russiagate. That explains how it took hold. That explains why those of us who would point out all the countervailing evidence that undermined the entire conspiracy theory. And by the way, it wasn't difficult. It requires not believing in Santa Claus. That's really all it is, because there really was nothing there. That's why those of us who did that were excluded. And that's why, we had just this crazy media culture for 2.5 years where, the most popular cable news host was an unhinged conspiracy theorist, Rachel Maddow. I mean, her show was insane.
We just got to moderate a presidential debate.
Right.
Yes, yeah, and so that's, of course, it never was going to deliver, and they tapped into the very real fear that Donald Trump has engendered, because of course he is a nightmare. But they weaponized all that for ratings, to deflect from the real self-reflection that should have resulted from Trump's win, and to pursue the interests of the national security state. And it was a perfect nightmare. And somehow it lasted for that long. And it lasted again because simply voices like mine and Glenn Greenwald and Margaret Kimberly from Black Agenda Report, who's speaking here now, all of us were just kept out. And that's how it sustained itself.
Not just kept out, but like really maligned. Like you people like Aaron have really been attacked, smeared, called, like you were saying, lots of names. I know it's not about you. I know.
It's only Twitter.
It's not. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's also the chatter, like the the liberati. But
Well,
it is powerful. This stuff is significant because editors are influenced by this too.
The relevant thing there, I think, or at least the most alarming thing there, for our purposes here, being a leftist gathering, is to the extent to which that dynamic took hold of progressive and adversarial outlets, which I don't think there's an exclusion. If you look at, Democracy Now!, The Intercept, my colleagues at The Nation, some of them, Mother Jones, obviously, and that's maybe worth talking about later. But it's that's the hard part, because then when the corporate narrative gets to set the terms of debate, and the main way to resist Donald Trump is through a conspiracy theory, and that takes hold even in adversarial outlets, that's a real problem. And it makes it a lot more difficult for those of us who weren't going along with it to reach people, and that's a problem.
To get to that narrative, as you would like. So to me, I mean, when you look at 2016 objectively, whether you like Hillary, whether you didn't, whether you got conned by Trump, objectively, there was an explosion of anti-establishment fervor on both sides. I'd say on the right, they kind of got conned by a billionaire pretending to be a populist. So you would think, wow, this is an amazing story for follow-up for the next year. Why are people so angry? Why are people so desperate? Why are we seeing this explosion of white nationalism? Why don't we go speak with people? But they don't want to do that because Comcast doesn't want that. AT&T doesn't want that. Amazon doesn't want that. So how can we distract? How can we distract away from police executing black men? 5% less black people came out in 2016 for Hillary Clinton than 2012 for President Obama. How can we distract from growing gentrification, which frankly Bernie's the only candidate talking about it, which is really, I mean, it's a dressed up word for economic violence. That's what gentrification is. How can we distract from exploding homelessness? I just covered Seattle homelessness, which is Jeff Bezos and Amazon are largely responsible for. How do we distract from these things? And that's in large part what corporate media exists to do, distract from the growing patterns and trends and make a boogeyman, whether it's Russia, whether it's Bernie, whether it's socialism and things like that. I'd love your thoughts on kind of the deflection you see in corporate media away from, I mean, it's not like the growing anti-establishment fervor has just gone away.
I think there's a few ways to talk about it. One of them is looking at the 2016 election, which is where a lot of my research and my reporting has been based. And the other is to look at what's going on right now. There's this assumption that we're hearing constantly from the establishment media is that Joe Biden has won over black voters. Joe Biden is the most electable. Joe Biden is the main one who can beat Trump.
Joe, my time is up, Biden.
Right, yeah, literally, take that to heart, sir. And what's interesting about that to me is that when you look at those headlines, and so I think probably all of us here are very online, And so I'm going through Twitter and I'm looking at just the captions of them, and they have these like really grand pronouncements about how, like, can anyone beat Joe Biden? Will Bernie Sanders be able to beat him? It's possible that he won't. But then when you actually click on the article and you read, even within their own, like, they're kind of refuting their own arguments, because one of them was about like white men not being able to win over black people except for Joe Biden, and they interviewed like 3 people. One of them was an older black dude who was like, yeah, Bernie's okay, but I think Joe Biden can beat, like, he's the most likely to beat Trump. But then if you keep seeing these captions and you keep seeing these headlines and these narratives, and then you look at just basic principles of journalism, how many people did you ask? How many different perspectives did you try and get? What data are you using? Like, it's based on relatively little data, if any. And when it is, it's looking at polling measurements that are coming out months, like several months before it even matters. Like at this time in the last election, Donald Trump had 1% of Republican approval. Hillary Clinton was like far surpassing anybody else in 2008, which obviously Barack Obama won in 2008 and 2012. And none of it is really based on even their own ethics that they prescribe for themselves. So that narrative to me, I think can create it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I don't believe it. Like if you talk to the average black person, it's like, he's questionable. I side with him maybe because he, was with Obama for the last 8 years. But when you actually interrogate it, it's not that all these black people just support Joe Biden. They've got pragmatic reasons for it. And a lot of us aren't conservative. We just tend to vote pragmatically. And then in the 2016 election, it's just been that convergence that Aaron was talking about, this convergence of trying to undermine Bernie Sanders' popularity. For instance, and I don't advocate for any particular politician, I advocate for policies. And in terms of left policies, there are a lot of black people who do support this, because when you look at kind of the gloss that has transpired talking about 2016, it's all these black people supported Hillary Clinton, but when you break that down, they supported her more in the South. But in the Midwest, where there's a history of black radical politics, there's a history of unionism, there's a history of socialism in Wisconsin, Bernie got the highest black vote. It wasn't a lot, but relative to a newcomer, he got the highest black vote in Wisconsin than anybody else in any other state in the Midwest. So what does that mean? So if he got 31% of the black vote, on average in the swing states for black people, but got about 10% in the South, that's a story. So just in terms of your curiosity as a journalist, I did not understand why no one was talking about that. There are maybe 2 other outlets. The New York Times had like a blurb about the disaffection of black people in the Midwest, and maybe some other folks were talking about what's been going on in like Wisconsin in general with deindustrialization, but no one was connecting that with their disaffection and not wanting to vote. We always heard that it was just Trump voters who were doing this, but when you look at the actual numbers, it wasn't so much that he pulled so many white people to him, because the voter turnout in Wisconsin actually went down by 1%. It was that half of the black people who voted in 2012 did not come out in 2016. It dropped from about 88,000 votes for Barack Obama in Wisconsin for black people to about 47,000 votes. So when you look at something that dramatic and the headlines are, oh, all these, racist white people who went over to Trump, that's true on any other presidential election. It's going to, most white people will vote for a Republican, but that wasn't a story to me, because that's every presidential election. So what happened in Wisconsin, what happened in the Midwest is something that I think the establishment media doesn't want to address, because then they would have to reckon with the fact that black people have a plethora of ideas, a plethora of attitudes, and there's a tradition of black radicalism all over the country that they did not choose to explore.
And I also want to point out, get your thoughts, the corporate media just has straight up lied about Bernie Sanders with black people. I mean, he actually won in 2016 millennial black people.
50%,
that's
yeah.
number one.
51.
Number two, they front-loaded most of the first states to be in the South, and they didn't know who Bernie Sanders was. So yes, he didn't do as well among older black people who also had an affinity for the Clintons, partly because of misinformation. I spoke with a lot of black people in South Carolina who really didn't even know the crime bill was under Bill Clinton. So also, I want to know your thoughts. There seems to be this media narrative that there's a white working class and separately things black people care about.
Yeah.
But I just covered General Motors laying off 15,000 people. There's a lot of black people that got laid off from General Motors. There's a lot of black people who work for a living. So I'd love your thoughts, because it seems like this is the weaponization of identity politics Katie was talking about. It seems like they we got to win that white working class back, acting like that's kind of somewhat separate from the black folks.
Yeah, I think a part of that narrative comes from being comfortable recognizing white supremacy and saying, okay, this is the reason why they're moving to Republicans, but very few, or even when you talk about even the white working class, very few are questioning the role of capitalism in that. Very few are questioning the role of neoliberal politics, deindustrialization in the Midwest that's doing that. And if they're not doing that for them, they're certainly not doing it for black voters. So for instance, because my focus has been in the Midwest, I've got a lot of Wisconsin anecdotes. But in Wisconsin, they've got the highest rate of black male incarceration. They have the highest rate of black male joblessness of all major cities in like their prime working years. All of these things that are going on because you had factories like A.O. Smith or Harley Davidson that left, and black people in the 70s were disproportionately in those industries in Wisconsin. And so when that left, when you had trade deals and interventionist policies and offshoring that is due to a lot of Democratic and Republican policy, black people are going to feel that the most. When we're talking about the Great Recession and the lowering of the home ownership rates, that is concentrated in the Midwest because of segregation and kind of de jure segregation. And so when you're not talking about these narratives, A, you're not talking about black people because you sympathize more with kind of white pain, but B, you're not questioning the role of capitalism in that and how it's affecting black people. And Hillary Clinton kind of said this, she encapsulated this the most when she said, a black mom doesn't care about her, they're not thinking about Wall Street when they have to worry about their son getting shot. Right. Wall Street or something like that. Do you remember the exact?
Well, she did. Not the banks. Well, breaking up the banks and racism.
Yes,
this is
that was it. Yes.
Yeah.
And then she was bringing up it's like really disingenuous arguments about black police violence and framing this as kind of dichotomous, right, as something that's completely separate from what's going on with the big banks, and the fact that under the Great Recession, and when you had these commodified securities, these commodified mortgages, that affected Milwaukeeans among the most anywhere else. It affected black people more than any other demographic, and then they were targeted by this. So we're not talking about systemic racism at all, and how capitalism has encouraged it, how it has been fed by racism, how it was created on the backs of black people. We don't get to talk about any of that because it's just Russia, Facebook.
I don't want to follow that.
I mean, the first question in the debate the other night, Bernie, are you going to raise taxes on the middle class?
Yeah.
Without pointing out that even a right-wing co-funded think tank said you save money overall. Even though your taxes go up, you save money under single payer. Can you kind of talk about more about that unholy alliance?
Yeah. Also, if there's any doubt in anyone's minds about this bias and about MSNBC trafficking in it, they asked him if he would drop out. When if someone else got, what was it? When he would drop out, if he would support, if it was clear someone was losing, someone else was winning. They don't ask anyone else this question. And I have to point out that Hillary Clinton in 2008, when she was running against Obama, was asked if, sorry, there's like these little mosquitoes or something, was asked if she was going to drop out. She said no, and they said, you don't buy that whole party unity thing. She goes, I don't, because my husband didn't drop out until June, and June, we all remember what happened in June, and that was Bobby Kennedy was shot. So basically she justified staying in the race because Barack Obama could get assassinated, and that actually, she got into trouble for that. Then Bill said that the campaign was playing the race card. Then Bill was asked about what he meant when he said the race card. He said, what are you talking about? I didn't say that, but it was on the radio. I mean, the Clintons are, God bless them, bless their hearts.
Really?
By the way, let's point out, Bernie Sanders it's a big scandal. Why aren't you releasing your taxes? Do you hear them asking the same thing about Joe Biden, who's been in the race now for 2 months?
No. But Bernie's a cheap, what is it? He's cheap, yeah, basically. He's cheap but not poor. You know, that's another narrative. There's the same people who, there's a real comfort with anti-Semitic. It's very weird for me because I spend most of my life when it comes to anti-Semitism saying that things are not anti-Semitic because people are calling things that are critical of Israel anti-Semitic. So it's a weird little bit for me role reversal, but like there are so many anti-Semitic tropes. Not Ilhan Omar does not use them, but Politico does. I mean, you see Bernie Sanders literally, you can't make this up. He was standing in front of a tree of money. Like it was a money tree. Instead of leaves, there were bills. And then he's holding 3 houses. I mean, then the thing with like a Pinocchio stuff. It's really disgusting. Yeah, the think tankification of politics. And then you have Third Way. And Third Way isn't even like Think Progress. So Think Progress is this very Clinton-aligned think tank. Third Way wrote terrible op-eds about warning Democrats from falling over the populist cliff in the footsteps of Bill de Blasio and Warren. And they want to cut they want to cut Social Security, they want to cut Medicare, they don't want to raise taxes. Their board of trustees in 2013, out of like 29, 20 were investment bankers, the rest were real estate, corporate lawyers, CEOs. And you know, it is relating to what you said, Malika, like there is a real weapon, you talked about how they present these things as in a dichotomy or mutually exclusive. Like there's racial justice and economic justice, according to these narratives. And Hillary Clinton famously said, right, like you were referring to, well, breaking up the banks and racism, no. First of all, they always do this straw man argument. No one's ever said, do this because it's gonna end racism, do that because it's gonna end sexism. I mean, no one said that about Lilly Ledbetter, right, which made it easier for you to sue because of pay discrimination. No one's like, is that going to end the pay gap? No, but no one said it would. And then, of course, as you referred to, like that was an extremely racialized, devastating thing that happened with the housing crisis. And you know, to pretend these things are unrelated is just so, or there's this talk about economic justice being a luxury. You hear that a lot. Like, oh, I wish I could care about that. I mean, this is not what real people say. This is what pundits say. And it's just, you know, there's this famous example. I don't want to give her too much credit, but she's just a scary person named Sally Albright. And Twitter, by the way, I think Twitter's a window, and I say it's a window into where the soul of the media would be, but it's a window. Like, it's not that I think it's changing the world per se, but it does give you insight into what these people think. It's kind of like a first draft or more honest thing. But she once said something like, and she's big in the resistance. She said that income inequality is just a problem for straight white men. The rest of us have bigger things to worry about, which was just like, wow, okay, I got it. Like, I guess she lives in a world where like, I don't know. Does she think like black women make more than white men or something? Anyway, but yeah, there's all these distractions, and I think that there's a really scary discussion about black people as this monolith, right? Like, it's very fetishizing and othering, and it's just this group of people that aren't politicized or aren't political, and they're all the same, and they all have the same ideas. And if you have some ideas that aren't the ideas that you may want people to have, then you're like a sellout. You know, you see this a lot. And there's this idea of what like real black voters think or want, which you were kind of pointing to. Which isn't really representative of the truth, and it's just a way for people who have neoliberal politics to pretend that there's some inherent racial justice built into those policies, which are of course extremely racist, and everything else is. So.
And Aaron, I'd like to ask you, I just texted you something along these lines today, but you've talked about, I mean, all of this distraction on Russiagate, it's totally covering up Mick Mulvaney's fuckery at the budget office, Rick Perry at the Energy Department. Trump is about to pass another massive tax cut. But Russia, basically all these the resistance to Trump seems to be focused on themes, narratives, and the other, like Russia and things, but not very focused on the policy. Yes, DACA and things like that, but the economic damage that he's done gets very little play, and this is in part how if you're gonna pluck off some of those Trump voters, how are you gonna do that if they don't know what the hell he's doing?
Exactly. The resistance to Trump, for the most part, has been, I think, a resistance to the reality that he was elected and a refusal to accept that, and then a resistance to dealing with the consequences of it. So those of us who called out Russiagate and challenged it, we were not just accused of being Putin apologists, whatever, but also being Trump apologists too. And there's two issues here. One, there's a journalism issue. Like, what are the facts? I mean, that's what we follow as journalists. Period. Sure, we have our partisan biases, but ultimately, if we're journalists and we're covering factual issues, we have fidelity to what the facts are. So there's a fact, but then also from a political point of view, and I don't hide the fact that I'm a leftist, I can't think of a bigger gift to Donald Trump than to take attention off of this radical administration, which has been radically enriching the coffers of the elites that it serves, increasing militarization abroad, making the immigration system even more cruel than it actually was. I can't think of a bigger gift to them than to take our attention and energy off of all of that and put it into a conspiracy theory and the hopes that these national security state bureaucrats like Robert Mueller would validate it. And if you look at the result, that's exactly what happened. And this is where I think it's important to talk about Russiagate in the context of Bernie Sanders' emergence. So Bernie Sanders showed that there could be a successful politician who almost won and probably would have won if not for the primary being rigged against them. Success coming from talking about real issues and talking about class issues and talking about challenging the elites. So, instead of, that was a challenge to elites, and so instead of, seizing on that momentum and building a movement against Trump based on all the energy that emerged during that primary and appealing to those who thought that in voting for Trump they were voting for a working class champion / anti-militarist, we put energy into a conspiracy theory. And to me, the biggest encapsulation of this is the fact that there were bigger protests over the firing of Jeff Sessions than there were over Trump's tax cuts, the largest upward transfer of wealth in U.S. history. I mean, think about that. So we're going to march in the streets for Jeff Sessions' job
Jeff Beauregard.
because we think it's going to threaten Robert Mueller's job. We're not going to march over tax cuts, over pulling out of the Iran deal, over pulling out of the Paris Accords, basically, which sets us off to existential peril. I mean, all these things get sidelined. So, I mean, in the drive for ratings and the drive to protect the status of the failed neoliberals who lost to Trump, we handed Trump a massive gift. And on top of the gift of diverting his resistance into a conspiracy theory that venerates intelligence officials, a conspiracy theory culture that venerates intelligence officials, we hand him the further gift of when it's all over, it's done, it's a dud, there's nothing there, there's no conspiracy, and he can go into election claiming vindication and talking about how he was, besieged by the deep state that wanted to bring him down. So this thing was a massive gift to him, and it shows the consequences of when we have a political system that is, based around serving the interests of privilege, not around serving the interests of average people and speaking to their concerns. And that's why I call Russiagate a privilege protection racket. That's ultimately what it was.
Well, I want to ask you, Aaron, Russiagate kind of ties into this whole military-industrial complex, but I mean, for people that know their history, the New York Times had CIA agents undercover there in the 1950s. Obviously, I mean, Amazon has I think $1 billion contract with the Pentagon, $600 million with the CIA, never disclosed. Can you kind of talk about how the military-industrial complex, the corporate media, props that up just as much as Wall Street?
Yeah, well, so in the context of Russiagate, you've seen it weaponized against anti-war voices. So, Bernie Sanders and Jill Stein and Tulsi Gabbard, they've all had to answer for the fact that there's articles claiming that Russian trolls boosted their campaign. And we're supposed to believe and take seriously for a second that has anything to do with their success and their appeal. It can't be because they don't accept the legitimacy of U.S. empire and that appeals to people who also don't want to see their tax dollars go to the war machine. It has to be because Putin is secretly supporting them via his sophisticated clickbait operation, where it happens to be, by the way, the same think tanks coming up with these figures happen to be funded by things like NATO via the Atlantic Council. I mean, that's a racket. There's basically a little side hustle around people willing to blame Russia for social media trolling, and they get big contracts for it. Even though if you read their reports they put out, they're ridiculous. Like, there was a Senate report official Senate report put up by this firm, New Knowledge, and they have a section in there about Russia's alleged social media campaign. And one of their examples for Russia's attempt to recruit assets inside the U.S. is they talk about how Russia exploits people's vulnerabilities. And so the first example of that was an ad featuring Jesus consoling a dejected young man. And Jesus says to him, "Are you struggling with masturbation? Reach out to me and we'll beat it together." So this apparently was put out by a Russian firm. And so according to the Senate commissioned firm, this has the imprimatur of a Senate study. That's an asset of Russia's asset recruitment in the U.S. And so, for that whole crowd, seeing the appeal of anti-war voices, has to be combated somehow. One of the ways you do that is you taint them with Russia's imprint. So that's why the strongest anti-war voices like Bernie and Tulsi Gabbard and Jill Stein have all been associated with Russian trolls.
And I want to point out, New Knowledge, the firm he's talking about, has been cited in the New York Times, NBC News, so is CrowdStrike, this third-party firm. Well, New Knowledge, you've reported on this, was found to be basically doing their own operation in Alabama to influence the Alabama election with Roy Moore and Doug Jones, where they were putting out propaganda. That's not mentioned in any of these articles. So, they look at, they try to spin like Aaron or Jill Stein, who's here, and other people as conspiracy theorists, but they're using already debunked and disgraced firms as basically their authoritative voice. So this happens over and over and over in the media. I mean, we touched on it, but Bill Kristol is on MSNBC morning, noon, and night. David Frum is an authority.
Nicole Wallace. Nicole Wallace? Nicole Wallace
has a show on MSNBC. I mean, who else are they going to bring up?
Who is Bush's, W's communications person.
Right. So we're led to believe it's only Fox News, but it's not. For God's sakes, I don't know if you all have seen this, but they've kind of gingerly rehabilitated George W. Bush. We long for the days of George W. Bush. Well, I'm not a Trump fan, but at least we're not at war with Iraq right now. At least, as far as I can see, we're not going to have the Patriot, we put the Patriot Act in, the Wall Street crash, and a whole lot of other terrible things. So I think that there is this kind of rehabilitation of actual warmongers and criminals. Obviously Trump is down with war too, but and there's also this elevation of people that in a civilized society we kind of have to
hang their heads in shame.
Exactly. Would like to ask you the same question, Katie, because I see with Bernie, Tulsi, Jill Stein, who, by the way, just to point out, the Green New Deal was originally Jill Stein and the Green Party's idea. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember Jill Stein was proposing canceling student debt too, which is now in vogue. So, obviously, Bernie's policies are now being knocked off by what I call faux progressives, but the Green Party hasn't gotten their due either.
Right.
But I'd like to educate
the MIC resistance. It's another word for the progressives. Yeah.
Right.
No, I don't know if you know this, but actually, canceling student debt is regressive according to the think tanks that represent Wall Street. So that's a good sign. I'd be worried if they liked canceling student debt. But there's this really dangerous narrative about universal programs being bad because poor people and working people have to pay for rich people's benefits. It's like, do you know history? Do you know that Newt Gingrich didn't talk about social security queens. He talked about welfare queens. People stigmatize means-tested programs, and they're obviously framed as charity, not as rights, and then they're much easier to cut and slash. I mean, it's just such a no-brainer. It's like, oh, this is the one area you don't want the rich to have, to get a free ride, is where it's going to actually help everyone else. Anyway, but in terms of the Russiagate stuff and the military-industrial complex, one of the scariest things I've seen is this. First of all, there's a real xenophobia, Russophobia. You have Keith Olbermann, who arguably, admittedly, kind of, I think, lives in his basement, which is where all these neocons should be, by the way.
I admit, He used to be a hero.
No, he was great,
Yeah,
of course.
yeah.
Of course he was. And then he talks about Russian scum.
He apologized, by the way, to Bush recently. Speaking of what
Oh
we were
my
talking about, he
God.
apologized. So he made his name with these rants against George W. Bush. He recently apologized to him.
I'm glad. You should send him like what's it called, a cake? What do you send people? Anyway, fruit basket. Yeah, thank you. But there's a really scary hawkishness that Dems have totally embraced. And I actually had Rokana on my show the other day, and he was like, well, I mean, half the Dems voted for the Iraq War. So, of course, it's a little naive to be surprised. But what's weird is that these are the same people who call Trump a Cheeto Mussolini, existential threat, Don the Con. They think they're going to, like, defeat him with their that way. But, and they call him that. Then at the same time, they say Putin's evil, and at the same time, they want him to ratchet things up with Putin. Like, what is the end game there?
And Iran.
And Iran, and North Korea. Like, people I know were upset that Trump kind of had that diplomatic success with North Korea to the extent that he did, because they didn't want him to be able to run on it. Like, that's it's like nuclear war, Trump gets some kind of, good talking point. But no, I mean, I think it's really scary, and it's a neo-conification also of, I mean, there used to, like, we all know Judith Miller, the New York Times was, beating the drums of war, but this is just a weirder thing because it's the same people who hate Trump so much who want him to be overseeing war. It makes no sense, and I really do think that there is such a thing as Trump derangement syndrome. I mean, the right uses that word, but there is. And I don't like Tucker Carlson. I don't like Laura Ingraham. I bring this up not to praise them, but to show how bad the left is. That you cannot get a skeptical voice about Syria on MSNBC. You have to turn, like Fox News is the anti-war resistance. And no, I don't think that I know they're not good people. I'm just saying, like, it is so bad that that's where you have to go to hear evidence about how there's been fabrication of stuff with Syria. Which is just pathetic, and yeah.
Let me pick up on that quickly because that's a big story. So recently it came out that that there was an internal assessment inside the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons that challenged the rationale for a Trump strike on Syria in 2018. And there was a detailed assessment that basically went through this had to do with an alleged chemical attack in Douma, Syria. And this leaked internal assessment that was never released officially by the OPCW undercut the rationale with a very detailed study. Now, I'm not technically equipped enough to judge the merits of it, but it did seem serious, and serious people like Ted Postal of MIT have said it's very serious. But yet, speaking, and the implication was that basically the rationale for U.S. war on U.S. strikes on Syria in April 2018 was phony, and that there's political compromise possibly at the world's highest chemical weapons body, as there was before under the Bush administration when John Bolton, put pressure on it to toe the line and even threaten people. But yet the response has been, in corporate media, basically silence, nothing. And even in adversarial media, the only major outlet to cover it amongst things I follow was Democracy Now!, which did a really kind of wishy-washy thing that wanted to minimize its significance, which speaks to the Syria issue. But to Katie's point, it's just getting anti-war discussions and anti-war stories out has become increasingly difficult. I think you can tie that to Russiagate. And by the way, something I should have said with Russiagate before, one of the other ways that's encouraged militarism is that all of these developments that undercut the conspiracy theory get ignored. So Trump pulling out of the INF treaty, thereby setting off a new nuclear arms race with Russia. Trump attempting a coup in Venezuela against Russia's ally. Trump bombing Syria twice. Trump increasing NATO membership and increasing the number of troops on Russia's borders. All these really dangerous things that increase militarism and tensions with Russia, which is existentially perilous given that these are the world's top nuclear powers. All these things get ignored because they undercut this idea that Trump is doing Putin's bidding. So we rather focus on Trump saying nice things about Putin at a news conference rather than his actual policies. So that's just one more way in which, on top of the Russophobia that Katie talked about, it's just one more way in which Russiagate has encouraged militarism.
And I also want to point out and get your thoughts. I mean, this is the corporate media. So there was actually a recent piece in Axios, of all places, that ratings have been down on cable news. There's kind of a Trump fatigue recently. Well, these are businesses. They got shareholders, they got big multi-billion-dollar corporate conglomerates. war's good for business. Fox News took over the ratings back in the early 2000s with the flags and Iraq War, and if ratings are down, I mean, Trump was, I think, credibly accused of sexual assault by another woman last week. It was barely on TV, but they were going, you know, Iran. Meanwhile, the Japanese owner of that tanker said, I don't know if it's Iran. I spoke with Senator Mike Gravel. He pointed out it was probably, the drone was probably in sovereign territory of Iran. That's the point of a drone, to spy on the other country, but they're just the same thing. They got the war generals on TV all day. They got the former military people that are now working in private security, conflict of interest, they don't disclose. So war and military is not only good for Raytheon, but it's good for CNN, MSNBC, New York Times. So that is a real ethical problem in our society, and that's part of why you continually have this military-industrial complex. Wanted to ask you, I also think part of this kind of elevation of war is stenography. Part of the corporate media is stenography. If I had a quarter for every time Barbara Starr on CNN said, the Pentagon says, the Pentagon says, they literally just repeat what U.S. intelligence agencies tell them. I mean, with Russiagate in particular, they kept saying, 17 intelligence agencies confirm it. They were including the Coast Guard.
But that's not even true, by the way.
Right.
That's another story, but that's not even true.
Right. So I wanted to ask you, part of journalism should not just be like, we're told this, you figure it out. But that's really what we have when it comes to Venezuela, when it comes to Iran, when it comes to Iraq, when it comes to basically all of these international stories.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of having people who ask questions, and we're talking about corporate media and this need to kind of race to have these profits. And so there are a few dynamics here. We have to consider the industry itself. The industry is pretty much dying because a lot of advertisers are going to Facebook and Google. So if they're trying to scramble for profits, then they're going to make a lot of their coverage entertainment. And you don't have enough resources really to devote in people who can investigate. So investigative journalism has really fallen off, which is why I have had to really kind of finance my own, any sort of studies that I want to do, I've had to finance on my own and just see who can reimburse me or cover the stories after that. So there is a challenge in the industry overall because it's not making the same sort of profits that it used to make. But then when you have this kind of corporatization of media and consolidation of media, that also means that local news channels get consolidated. So kind of going back to our previous points in terms of the military-industrial complex and how that is imparted through, our news organizations. A personal anecdote is my growing up in Georgia and having my Congresswoman, Cynthia McKinney, was the first person that I had an opportunity to vote for. Speaking of the Green Party, so in 2004, I was able to cast my vote for her to go to Congress, and around the same time, she was getting a lot of pushback because of her anti-imperialist stance, her pro-Palestinian stance. She was asking, George Bush, what did you know and when did you know it? And eventually, it came to bear that there were some things that they did know, but at the time she was painted as an extremist. And we had local news media who were a part of the same narrative, who were saying she needs to get kicked out, she can't be in office. And she'd been in Congress maybe for about 12 years by that point. And so when you have the same kind of mainstream legacy outlets saying the same things that news, like your local news at 11 o'clock is saying, and no one is really interrogating it, then that's a problem, and that speaks directly to the commodification of media, because we're not getting people to investigate, we're not getting people giving them any liberty to question American foreign policy whatsoever, and they're immediately painted as extremists. And so after that, we ended up having people tell us, it kind of reminded me of what happened in 2016, where people were saying, well, black people just wanted a new voice. They didn't want a radical voice anymore. But then when you see what actually happened in that midterm election where she was voted out, it wasn't because black people just didn't vote for her. You had an influx of Republicans who were in neighboring districts who went and voted against her. They voted for her challenger because we have open primaries in Georgia. And so I saw the direct impact of what a media machine can do with a single congresswoman who's just saying, what did he know? When did he know it? And all of a sudden it became this witch hunt. And, since then, we haven't had any radical voices in Georgia, but I was able to grow up with it, but for a while, we haven't had that return to the state.
And this kind of goes, what you're saying, New York Times, in addition to politically call Bernie a cheat Jew, New York Times has been doing the McCarthyism against Bernie now. So there was 2 stories in 48 hours. Oh, Bernie brought the Soviet Union back to Vermont.
Yeah.
And they were, the reporter...
Ember, it was Sydney Ember, yeah.
Ember.
That was who when she
didn't care
quoted.
about anything else. What America was doing to Nicaragua, the Contras. Why didn't you leave this rally where you heard anti-American fervor? So, and they're again trying to paint Bernie. It's not about, is there any problem with the things America has been doing? It's about, if you're not like, fuck yeah, America all the time, you're part of the problem. And
Yeah, I think to kind of go off of that, just thinking about sort of the pipeline into journalism, the woman who interviewed him just clearly had no sort of understanding of U.S. history. So even if there is kind of an angle or a slant that people might have, the other problem is that you're getting people from a very particular population. You're getting people who have enough money to pay for journalism school, knowing that it doesn't pay that well, knowing that they're going to get into a lot of debt, that they're probably not going to make enough money. So you probably have a semblance of trust fund babies and folks who have enough privilege where even their life experiences didn't tell them to question these things. They weren't surrounded by this in their family. Like, I grew up with, my family are activists. Like, I grew up under Black nationalism. I couldn't have gone through like a traditional journalism path because I couldn't afford that. And so we've had to kind of go in it through side doors by freelancing or doing film projects. But to go through like the traditional journalism path, you got an internship, meaning you got to know somebody who's an editor there or a hiring manager there, and all that comes with connections, and it comes with coming from communities where you are privileged, where you do tend to be white, where you do tend to be male, and you're not exposed to other world views.
That was Ember. She was the one who I just did that piece on, and her track was Brown University, and then BlackRock, and then getting hired to do business at the Times, and then going straight from that into Bernie Sanders. And that piece, that total red baiting piece, where she said her first question for Sanders was whether he had heard at a rally with like 50,000 people, whether he had heard the anti-American chanting, and if he had, would he have stayed at it? She really asked him that. And another interesting thing about that, and of course that was the piece that she quoted Otto Reich for, again, the guy who did PR for the Contras. This is a guy who worked with PSYOPs people, with CIA people, and threatened journalists if they weren't supportive enough of the Contras, and if they were too critical of the Contras and too truthful and honest about the Sandinistas. This article was one of the most infuriating things I've ever read. Everyone here knows this, but like, she didn't discuss the fact that they would rape, torture, skin people. She didn't say anything about the Contras. She said that there were some allegations of atrocities, and this is just an example of, and she totally both sides did. And this is just an example of how the stenography you were talking about. She mentioned Grenada, which I'm sure she had never heard of before she worked on this piece. She mentioned Grenada, and she linked to a piece from the time of the invasion that was the New York Times, that literally was Reagan administration's justifications for the invasion of Grenada. Like, she linked, that was her link. She went to that.